This is A Geek Leader. Hey guys, John Rada back again with episode 53 of A Geek Leader, and today we have Art Doler on the podcast. Art and I met at Codestock this past year, and he gave some talks about psychology, and I was really inspired by the things that he had to say and kind of his background of how he came into kind of pulling psychology and development in together. And Art's a developer. And we just had a really good conversation kind of about the mind and how to condition the mind and the fact that, you know, your brain is one of your most important assets. And how do you take care of that? And how do you get yourself in the right frame of mind and the right mindset to move forward? We talked about imposter syndrome. We talked about all kinds of different psychology topics, fixed versus growth mindset, and many other things. We also mentioned one of my favorite books, Drive by Dan Pink. And it's just a really good episode, and you really need to just check it out, listen, and hit Art up after the show on Twitter and let him know how much you've enjoyed this talk. Thanks so much, and give it up for Art Doler. And we're live. I've got Art Doler with me, and Art and I met at Codestock a few months ago and had some interesting talks surrounding mental health and development and putting those two things together, which seem pretty far apart, but he did a great job of kind of melding the two worlds together, and I want to talk to him a little bit about that today, so I'm blessed to have him on the show. And Art, if you could just spend a few minutes telling me about your journey and kind of how you got to where you're at, and we can take it from there.
Sure. So my journey starts with me as a kid, like most people, but I'd always been interested in technology and technological stuff. And I remember being young, checking out a book from the library of DOS programs and typing that into the terminal on the Apple IIe that put in if you didn't have a disk, the thing that would come up painstakingly, putting in line after line and not realizing why it didn't work because it was a book on DOS Basic and not Apple Basic. But I was pretty much hooked from that point. It was an avenue to me that made a lot of sense and offered me, in some ways, a degree of control that I didn't have in a lot of the rest of my life, which starts tying into some of the mental health stuff. I have what I like to call lived experience. And the general definition for that term is just, I know what it's like to fight against my brain. I know what it's like to have to have feelings and emotions that I'm not in control of. And that's been a part of me since before I can remember. So I spent a long time living with that and being alone with that, and trying to hide it and, focusing instead on the technical world and on the developer side of things and getting good at Java originally and then getting good at JavaScript and now doing whatever. I spent a large chunk of today working in structured text, which is a language that's based on Pascal. So, but the point is more that at some point during that journey, I realized that the mental health side of things was not something that I should be putting in a closet, trying to hide away. It was something that was a part of me, and it was a part of how I worked. It was a part of how my brain worked and how I process information. And more importantly, it was a part of how I communicated with other people and how I worked with other people. And so talking about it was, to me, it became something that was almost ethically responsible. Like I had to do it because otherwise I was hiding something from my team. I wasn't talking about my experience. I wasn't talking about how I felt. Yeah,
I think that's really important because you're not alone. There's so many people out there that feel the same way, that feel like they can't share and they can't hear about it. And when you take the bold steps to share openly and publicly the things that you're going through, it helps other people that may not be as confident to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that this is I am cognizant of the fact that it's a privilege that I get to do this because I know that there are people who can't do it for whatever reasons. They're in a job that feel like I've talked to people who've had a boss who just explicitly does not believe that mental illness or mental health challenges are a thing, that it's just people being lazy and they should try harder. And I've talked to people, especially people with kids, with that mentality.
Wow.
And it's, I'm not necessarily condemning them. It's a mindset that is frustrating, and it's a mindset that is harmful in a lot of ways. But people come to that for a lot of different reasons. But the point is more that I realize that I am capable. I am allowed to do this because my challenges are not as strong as some people's. My challenges are not as hard as some people's, and so it is easier for me to be out there and talking about this stuff. And that, as you say, that's important because other people see that and talk about it and realize that it's a thing that goes on. I liken it to, if you get a bunch of senior developers, they're usually not asking questions like in, your team Slack or whatever. They're not asking questions over broadcast email. They know exactly who on the team they need to talk to get a question answered. Right?
Yeah.
And so sorry.
No, keep going. You're doing good.
That means, though, that the juniors on the team, the mid-levels on the team, don't see them asking questions. And it looks like they know everything already. It looks like they're already, they have all the answers they need. And if they go, they don't have to ask anybody a question. And so that means that the juniors and seniors, or juniors and mid-levels, start to feel like they can't ask questions. Like if they do, it's a failure. This is something we see all the time in software. And it leads to people wasting time, feeling frustrated, feeling a whole bunch of imposter syndrome. And it's the same kind of thing. You just have to – everybody's having these challenges in one way or another, in some degree or another. And if we don't talk about them, if we don't tell each other when it's happening, then we feel like we're alone in that room, And especially if you've gone through the psychiatric care system, if you have been – well, if you've been through the public care system, if you've been hospitalized, that is atrocious. And a lot of times that can be very traumatic. But if you're lucky enough to be in the private care system, it's still pretty bad because you're almost alone on an island with you, your therapist, and your psychiatrist, just kind of talking about it in the half an hour or an hour that you get every month with these people. And the rest of the time, it's just kind of you alone in your head.
Yeah, there's a quote that I thought about when you were saying, that younger developers don't see the senior developers asking the questions because they've learned where to go. And the quote was that one of the reasons we struggle with insecurity is because we compare our behind the scenes with everyone else's highlight reels. And I feel like that is even more prevalent now with social media the way it is, and the ability to kind of hide certain parts and show other parts and filter things here and there. I feel like it's just expanding that mindset and that insecurities versus, whereas we should be using technology to revert that.
Absolutely. It's the keeping up with the Joneses for the web 2.0, And I see your vacation snapshots and your shots of your perfectly cleaned house and shots of this thing immediately after the renovation or whatever. And I don't see 2 weeks later when there's crap everywhere all over the floor because you're too busy to clean it up or whatever. Right.
Right.
And that's definitely a thing. Actually, there was I forget the name of the company, but they were a mental health company that put on a parody. Like they had a parody company that they had a website for. And they sold it like a service. They would go through and basically you could buy packages for your social media. Then they would upload the stuff, and they would be like, "Oh, your perfect vacation package," or my beautiful children package. And if you went through and clicked through to purchase or whatever, it would take you to a site that was like, "Man, doesn't that suck?" But you're exactly right. Is people compare themselves to what we see and not what's actually happening. And that's related to a cognitive bias called the fundamental attribution error, which is just everywhere. Which the fundamental attribution error is I tend to feel that my behaviors and actions are a result of circumstances, and everybody else's behaviors and actions are a result of innate traits. And it's closely related to the actor-observer bias. And the actor-observer bias is exactly what you're talking about, which is you see other people's actions. You don't necessarily see all of the things around it. You're an observer that only has a limited amount of information. And that leads to us having that fundamental attribution error about other people, right? About, that person's so smart. It works both positive and negative.
Yeah. So if we do, you've identified these issues that we have, these biases that are everybody really experiences these in one way or another. How is it that we can help overcome this and help see around these things so that we aren't putting ourselves down whenever we see someone else's success?
Unfortunately, a lot of the cognitive biases that we deal with occur at a level that's kind of below consciousness. They're things that inform our decisions. They're things that cause us to feel certain ways that change us that way. But that doesn't mean we're powerless against them. A lot of the power that we have is awareness and thinking about things logically, thinking about things in our, prefrontal cortex, up in the logical conscious side of things. Because if we listen a lot to our emotions and we buy into what our emotions are telling us, that can be very negative. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that we need to discard emotion entirely. I've tried that. It doesn't work. I have the years in therapy to prove it. But we have to be aware of what we're feeling and just use that as another piece of input in our daily lives. So in the case of something like the actor-observer bias, a technique like what's called cognitive behavioral therapy is really powerful. And you can find a lot of different books and worksheets and things like that to work through cognitive behavioral therapy. But cognitive behavioral therapy kind of has you look at those feelings and say, all right, well, is it an always thought? Is it am I thinking about always or forever or never? Is it really black and white? Or am I thinking about things in terms of just from my perspective? Is there another perspective that makes sense? And for things like the actor-observer bias, we can start saying, well, no, if we take the moment to think about it, obviously there are things happening in other people's lives that we're not seeing. Mm-hmm. If our friend has a really bad argument with their spouse, they're not going to post that on Facebook unless their relationship is really deteriorated, right? And so we know that those things are happening. We know that they're having disagreements and arguments. We know that because all couples really do.
Right.
So just taking that moment to tell ourselves a different story than what our emotions want to be telling us gives us that moment to go, oh, okay, all right, that makes sense. And for things like the fundamental attribution error, which can really crop up on teams, so like a really good example is, all people, in QA just want to slow my life down. They want to make my life hell. I can't believe they're asking questions about this. Why don't they understand? I just need to ship these tickets across the way, right? And that's a gross stereotype of the QA person, but we feel it to be true emotionally because we consider them to be what's called an out group. In psychology, that's the term, where they're a group that we're not part of.
Yeah.
And once we tend to lump people in out groups, it's a lot easier to do things like, say, well, all QA are like that. Mm-hmm. Or, and it's because they're all persnickety assholes that just like things to be one pixel over, it has to be pixel perfect and exactly right. And God forbid if it does a thing and it doesn't send you to the right error case.
So is this where like stereotypes and things come about?
Yeah. Stereotypes are and a lot of the cognitive biases are time-saving and energy-saving techniques that your brain developed because the world, when we'd evolved, was not quite as complex as it is now.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we evolved on savannas of Africa, and we grew up in communities of less than 100 to 200 people. I mean, there's a reason people's the number of friends you actively can pay attention to on Facebook is around that 100 to 200 number.
If you go Doler's number, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's based on, the theory is that it's based on those initial communities, but the basic thought of our brain got hardwired when we lived and behaved in a particular way. And now we have cars and the New York Stock Exchange and computers that are operating faster than we can even think. Mm-hmm. The world is now really complex. And unfortunately, the firmware that we're running on has not updated. So this stuff was designed to keep track of a world that doesn't change as frequently as it does now, and where we would not see the variety of things that we do now. I mean, if you're locked in in a specific place and you only see one type of person, one group of people, you can start making stereotypes, and they help a lot. But when you can encounter, like in the U.S., you can encounter 12 to 20 different ethnicities and different groups of various identity types in a given. 20 is really low, but in a given day, you could easily encounter that, and stereotypes can really start to hurt at that point.
Yeah, that makes
but
sense.
Yeah, it's that I build a mental model of these things, and because it's so much more complex to think about, oh well, this person's an individual, and this, now they have this piece of context around them that drives their behavior. Suddenly I have to put that in my mental model, and it's yet another thing to keep track of, and it's a giant pain. So it's just easier to just think about, well, that's Bob, and Bob is lazy. Bob's always lazy.
Yeah, no, that makes good sense. So if I'm struggling with some of these stereotypes or some of these issues, and obviously I don't want to talk publicly about them because I get shunned for doing that, what do we do?
A lot of the things can be helped by, well, especially for like the fundamental attribution error or the stereotype threat, things like that. It can be helped by regrouping people. So one of the things that I advocate for is not for QA to be a separate team, for QA to be part of your team, right?
Like
Same
part
with
of
the
your Scrum
design
team or
Scrum team, however you're organized in a company,
yeah.
But you reorganize based on what you're trying to do, on a common goal. And that common goal is really easy to come to. You're delivering quality software. And so that mindset, like the retrospective mindset of, everybody who's here did the best they could with what they have, it's kind of like that. You just hold that mentality in your head of, this person is doing what they're doing because they want us to deliver quality software and they want to deliver value to the user. And suddenly it feels like a really subtle shift, but that can really dramatically affect how you respond to somebody, because we want to take things personally, right? If somebody's coming back at us in a QA saying, well, these 7 things are wrong, or even one of our other developers. I used to get very mad at peer reviews sometimes. And it's not
get very mad giving peer reviews.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly the same thing, right? Because if you're giving a peer review, if you're putting these things in there, it's like, how can you not know? How can you not think about this?
Yeah.
Because that's what we're there, being frustrated because we feel like the other person maybe should know those things. And that's a whole different context in terms of how we learn and how we teach, which is a different matter entirely. But trying to regroup and say, okay, look, this person did the best they could, and they're trying to deliver quality software. And maybe that one of the things people say is, well, maybe they're not. And it's like, maybe they're not. Maybe they're doing software because their mom said you really should go into software, and they really want to be a pro guitarist. I don't know. But you kind of give them the benefit of the doubt until it starts proving itself to be false. Mm-hmm. So that mentality of, look, this person did the best they could, or the person who is giving me advice, the person who is telling me about things, the person who's giving me this peer review, is trying to make sure that we're delivering quality software. Like, they're not yelling at me specifically. They just want to make sure we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is getting on the same perspective. And I know whenever I give one-on-ones with my team, one of the things that I used to struggle with was seeing things from the other person's perspective. And I made it a point that about 5 or 10 minutes before I give my one-on-one, I shut my door. I try to think, what was this person's day like prior to them coming into my office? What was their commute like? How many kids, what was their life like at home before they got here? Were their kids running around crazy like mine, or were they well behaved, or did they not have kids? Did they listen to podcasts on the way in? Did they listen to music? What's their project workload like? Are they going to come in here upset with me because I missed something? And I try to think about how I would feel if I was in their shoes walking into my office. Or am I nervous because I'm going to talk to my boss, or am I comfortable, or am I excited I get the opportunity to talk to my boss? Because everybody's going to come in differently, and what's their mindset going to be coming in?
That's perfect. That's exactly what you're doing, is trying to reconstruct that context for them, right? Trying to go, okay, here's the mindset. And that stuff can really help in terms of, especially for things like one-on-ones, being able to deliver effective feedback. Yep. Right? Because if you, like we talked about with peer reviews, if you drop a piece of feedback on somebody like, well, you should have known this, their brain is going to start kicking into high gear because the funny part about our brains is that you've heard of the fight or flight, right? The parasympathetic nervous system.
But can you explain it?
Brains
my psychology level is pretty low.
No worries. So it's the parasympathetic nervous system, which has nothing to do with parapsychology, interestingly enough. But the parasympathetic nervous system is the thing in the very back of our brains, what they call the lizard brain, that controls what's called the fight or flight response. And when we get put under threat, when something threatens us physically, we have this innate gut response to either flee or fight that thing. Like just either shut down and run away or just go attack it completely. Mm-hmm. Our brains have helpfully decided at some point along the line that when we get put under social threat, it does the same thing. So when our social standing or our identity or something we hold dear in terms of our, like how we view ourselves gets put under threat, we react the same way. And so confronting somebody aggressively about, well, you're a terrible developer because you don't, because you use almond brace style instead of this other brace style, right? Literally puts them in that mindset of, now I have to fight you. Like, I'm either going to shut down and run away or we're going to fight. And I've been in arguments with people where I precipitated that by coming out and offering a judgment immediately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. I struggle with that, especially when I was early on as a manager, thinking that if you didn't do it my way, you're obviously doing it wrong. And so therefore, I'm right, you're wrong, and let's move past this. And I even catch myself now going through that same mindset, which is really hard because it's after you do it, you realize, oh man, I should not have gone down that path.
Yeah, it's very hard, especially because, a lot of our schooling and a lot of the way we as developers have our culture is about absolute correctness. It's about, this thing is always correct and you should always do this thing. That goes all the way back to what pointers considered harmful, or go-to considered harmful, rather, right? We've had those arguments since basically before they were programming languages. And it is a mentality that has stuck with us and that we get trained into. And it is in some ways it's comfortable, right? To think that there is one way to do things and you should do always this thing. And if you don't do that, then you're wrong. And if you do that, you're right. Black and white worldviews are in some way really comforting and easy because there's so much less to think about. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, we work in a world, well, not unfortunately, but unfortunately for that mindset, fortunately for everything else, we work in a world with other human beings, and they have different thoughts and opinions because they're not us, which is probably for the best because I don't think I would want to work with a whole bunch of other arts. I think we would get on each other's nerves immediately.
Yeah, I think most people would be like that. I know if I had to work with me, I probably would not like it very much. So one of the things I've heard you talk about a lot is one of my favorite books, and that's Drive, and Daniel Pink, where he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose and motivation, and how does that play into this mental health of engineers?
Right. So, well, the mental health piece, we talked a lot about talking about it. We talked a lot about being out there about it, and again, kind of because of the culture of things that we've had since Netscape, and I really honestly, I don't blame Netscape per se, but they are patient zero in terms of this mentality that we as developers have about our work, where we brag about hours that we spend. Oh yeah, I worked 60 hours last week. Oh, I worked 70. Really? Thank you.
That sucks.
Yeah, that sounds really awful. I'm sorry. But as we talk about that work-life balance, it is also important to realize that work itself is an activity where we want to have a balance of what we're doing. We need to have a balance of power and a balance of our capabilities. So Daniel Pink breaks it down into autonomy, mastery, and purpose, like you said. It's a really great book, and that was the first book. It was that was my gateway drug into pop psych and into all of this stuff. So everything else is chased on from there. But he talks about it in those ways. And so autonomy, you have to be able to develop things on your own, doing things your own way. And if you have a manager like who says, well, this is the one way to do it, and we're going to do it this way, and you say, but what about these reasons? And they're like, but I'm the manager, so you can go to hell. That's not going to really, that will actively harm your motivation, right? I mean, and you can feel that, like your response to that's like, well, okay, fine, you can write this. And suddenly you find yourself doing what they call subconscious sabotage. You'll slow roll things. You'll find ways to get distracted or find ways to wind down rabbit holes. And this isn't a thing that I'm accusing anybody of doing consciously. It's just your brain starts to go, I don't want to do this. And so it finds ways to get distracted. It's out there looking for them. So you also have that mastery. You have to be able to develop your craft. And that is a thing that we are not great at because we often feel like everybody else should be developing at the same speed and pace that we are. And that can lead to that kind of imposter syndrome that, well, why don't you just know this already? It was easy. It was obvious to me from the documentation. Well, maybe the documentation lended itself to your particular style of consuming information, and it didn't work for me because I tend to have to sit back and think about things and chew on things because that's just the way my brain works. And it doesn't make either of us less intelligent or more intelligent. It just means my brain works differently than yours.
Yeah. Yeah, we had Jim Holmes on not too long ago, and he talked a little bit about depression and the imposter syndrome. I want to get your take on what is it we can do to combat that imposter syndrome? Because I know I've dealt with it, and I still deal with it today. I have this vision of HR just busting through the door with a clipboard saying, hey, it's up. The gig's up.
Yeah, right? Yeah, congratulations. We figured it out.
Yeah.
14 years of you working in development, but we know you're a fraud now. It's okay. So for starters, things you can do if you are feeling that. One, reflect. Take the time to reflect on things that you have accomplished because we don't do that a lot. We're often very much on to the next ticket, the next thing. And what we see is that giant mountain of work in front of us and not the giant mountain of work we've accomplished. And that part, unfortunately, that part of a retrospective, which is usually about celebrating the work that we accomplish, is often perfunctory or kind of cheesy or lame. We don't take the time to just celebrate that, we're out there kicking ass.
Yeah, a lot of times it goes down the rabbit hole of the negative things that didn't work and not the positive things that worked.
Well, and again, that goes back to we're developers. Our job is to look at things and find the ways it's going to break.
Yeah.
That's our job. That's the job of any engineer, really. And that's why I, consider software engineering to be engineering, is we look at it and say, this is what's going to break. And it makes us very judgmental and it makes us very negative prone to negativity. But from that perspective, again, of the imposter syndrome, the other piece is look for the other people in your organization and look at what they're actually doing. Don't follow them around creepily, but maybe ask if you could just partner with them for a day. Like, hey, can I just shadow you for a day? Yeah, okay, it's 8 hours, whatever. Take vacation if you have to, but just watch them. Watch how often they go to Google or Stack Overflow. And the answer, especially if they're a senior, it's going to be a lot because they've forgotten a lot of things too. And that goes to the other part of things. It's called the Google effect, is another cognitive bias. Our brains don't like to remember things. It's harder than remembering where we found that thing. So, and people complain that this is something that came around with computers. We've been doing that with books for centuries. We've been doing it with people for millennia. And you can look around your office and see people doing the same thing. Like I talked about with the seniors earlier, you go talk to Alice because Alice has CS down pat.
Yeah.
And so if you have a CSS problem, you go talk to Alice. I don't have to remember it because Alice knows.
No, you're absolutely right. I know, when I was growing up before, cell phones and dating myself a little bit here, I remembered all my friends' telephone numbers, dozens of telephone numbers.
Exactly.
I don't know my own number now.
Right? And so, that's exactly the same thing. It's just your brain goes, oh, that's fine. I know exactly where to find that, and it's always there, so I never have to worry about it anymore. And so being aware of that, and being aware of that being what happens in people's brains, is another way to help dial back and just recognize that your feelings aren't necessarily grounded in fact. Because that's really what's happening, is that you have these feelings about being an imposter and have these feelings about being a fraud that aren't grounded in reality. They're grounded in some aspects of it, but there are different perspectives you can take on reality that make those less, or at least make them either go away or at least make them diminish. And then from the other side of things, if you're trying to create an organization that diminishes imposter syndrome, you need to be aware of what's called the curse of knowledge. It's the cognitive bias that's we don't remember what it was like to not know a thing. Like once you've learned a thing, we cannot envision what it's like to not know it. It just seems so simple.
Yeah, because I can tell you a story about that. A couple months ago, I was working with my daughter to teach her how to ride a bike.
Yes.
I'll tell you how hard it was for me to teach someone how to ride a bike, because I can't teach you how to ride a bike because I don't know what it's like not to ride a bike. I had to I watched probably 2 or 3 hours worth of YouTube videos on how to teach a kid how to ride a bike because I could not remember. I could not put it back in my head of what was it like before I knew how to ride a bike.
Right. Your muscles are like, well, we just do this thing.
Yeah. I was like, you just balance. And she's like, well, how? I was like, I don't know. I don't know how you just balance.
I remember my dad trying to teach me how to ride a bike, and he just like behind me running, screaming, pedal, and it's like, I am pedaling.
Yeah.
I mean, because he didn't know what to say. And I mean, so that curse of knowledge is very important, because it means it's kind of like, well, you built a ladder to get to where you are. And then as soon as you get up there, your brain just goes, nope, don't need that anymore. And you kick the ladder to pieces. And so breaking tasks down into smaller chunks, consciously looking at what you're doing, whether that's or via YouTube or they're figuring out from somebody else what the steps are, and going, okay, in order for me to teach you about React or Redux, rather, I have to teach you about immutability. I have to teach you about message passing. I have to teach you about, what are the individual concrete concepts you need to know to get to that bigger concept. I mean, and this is a big part of the work that teachers do in, syllabus and crafting syllabi and crafting curriculum for people. And it's, I consider it a usually unsung or unappreciated effort, because it's phenomenally important. Because again, we just want to turn around and go, well, I can do this instantly. And because our brain conflates how easy it is for us to think of something with how easy it must be, we go, oh, yeah, that should be really easy. Why can't you just do that? Nope. So, but also communicating to the people on the team about how often you're looking for help, and communicating about their state of mind, asking them for questions, asking them how they feel about a task, asking them, in trying to reinforce the message that it's okay to ask for help. Maybe you I've heard of teams setting like a 15-minute to 30-minute limit, where it's if you spend 15 minutes on your own and you never spend more than 30 minutes, like at least 15 minutes before you ask someone and never more than 30. Like if you spent half an hour, it's time to go ask somebody.
Yeah, that's good, because I remember at my last job when I was managing a web and mobile development team, we had a couple of people that would spend hours working on things by themselves and never would ask, and sometimes days even before they would ever go ask. Whereas other people, as soon as they hit the first inkling that they didn't know how to do something, they would ask someone. And I thought at first that was really good because they're not afraid to ask. But then I got to the point where they're just bothering people all the time.
Right.
So that 15 to 30 minutes is very, I think that's a really good time box.
Yeah, I mean, you can set that time box to be whatever you want for the team. Whatever works for your particular team, but getting that and not being angry at somebody when that happens. Like if they spend it's their third day where they're like, I'm working on this ticket, not being angry and accusing them of sandbagging and accusing them of just, slacking off, turning around and going, okay, let's sit down and talk about it. What is your feeling here? Why are you, what are you stuck on? It's okay, helping them walk through even just the emotions of that, because it's very, very, it's often very hard to ask for help. And especially if you are a male in America, a lot of the times that kind of toxic masculinity seeps in to our brains, and we feel like it's not okay to ask for help. We have to do things on our own.
Yeah, and I think I've had to try to shift my mindset because my dad was one of those that would never ask for help. You know, he always wanted to try to figure it out himself, and I've tried to learn that it actually takes bravery to ask for help. And I've been taught you want to be brave and ask for help then.
Exactly. And I was the other kind of kid. I was completely impatient. I remember looking up cheats constantly for video games. Just, how do I get past that puzzle? Oh, this is how I get past that puzzle.
Up, down, left, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I was very goal oriented and focused in that regard. So asking for help for me it wasn't a negative thing because, until the time when I ran up like $100 worth of credits off the LucasArts hint line back in the 90s. But again, dating myself.
Yeah, nice.
That was always the mentality, and so I had to learn to make sure I was taking the time to look for something to answer myself. Like you said, you don't want to. Well, let's frame it back in the context of that Google effect. The more time you spend looking on the answer yourself and figuring it out yourself, your brain will remember that better than it will you going to somebody else and asking. And similarly, if you can turn around and when somebody asks you a question, give them pointers in the right direction, but not necessarily straight out answer it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that gets into, isn't it faster to just give them the right answer? Absolutely. But the question is whether what is the point of what you're doing? As a senior developer, is your job to crank out a whole bunch of code, or is it to help pull people up behind you? And different companies have different mentalities on that.
No, yeah, I get this. I struggle with this myself. I just had this conversation with someone on my team recently where I kind of let them go through a project on their own, and there was some things I saw that I could have jumped in and corrected right away, but I knew it wasn't mission critical. It wasn't something that's going to be long-term effects. But if I jumped in there and told them the right things to do and what to do right now, I don't think they would have learned the correct way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
They would have just depended on me as being a crutch, and they wouldn't have had to say, "Oh, now I get why I have to do it this way."
Yeah, I mean, our brain is keyed to learn based on negative things that happen to us more than positive things.
Yeah, and it did delay the project for a week or two, but it still wasn't it wasn't detrimental. But I think the long-term effects of them learning was far greater than a couple weeks delay.
Yeah, because now they know that answer. It's in their head. It's going to be part of their behavior. Right. So it's a question of, the short term versus long term gain. It's a question of how much are you budgeting in terms of making sure you are budgeting for that time in your projects, almost budgeting time to be wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the things I do sometimes when I look at a project and I think, wow, this could be a very good learning experience. Let me add in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. I like that mindset, though. And that's actually a big point that I want to mention this because it's another piece that I find really valuable from my personal experience. There is a book called Mindset by Carol S. Dweck, Dr. Carol S. Dweck.
Yes, I've read that book, but it's been a while.
Yeah, and she talks about the difference between fixed mindset and growth mindset. And fixed mindset is where you view a particular attribute or all of your attributes as set. They're fixed. They're never going to change. And I remember growing up and feeling that I got praised a lot for being smart, for, doing, well, I also got told I did a whole bunch of dumb things, but, people would tell me I was so smart and I figured stuff out and great. Problem is that I folded that smartness into my identity, and that became part of my identity. I was smart, but I didn't view that as something that I needed to grow. I viewed it as something that was fixed. I was already smart. People told me I was smart. They never included you're smart for an 11-year-old.
Right.
It was implied to them, but I'm 11. I don't even have abstract thought yet. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to connect those dots. So I started having problems where I would avoid complex or work that was challenging because I could fail. And if I fail, that means I'm not smart. And that's because that's now part of my identity, because that's something I value in myself. I don't want that to not be true. So I avoid hard work. If I find something, if I start feeling exertion, if I start feeling challenged, that means I'm brushing up against my limits. If I find something that I can't solve, then I'll never be able to solve it, and I should never think about it again. Contrast that with the growth mindset, where we believe that these attributes are things that we can improve. And growth mindset says, okay, if I encounter something that, starts to get, I start to feel exertion, I start to feel effort, that means I'm improving. That means I'm getting better. And if I start feeling like I've hit a problem I can't solve, I can use that as a guidepost for future learning. Like, maybe I can't get it right now. What do I have to go back and get to so that I can now solve that problem? What do I, maybe I have to go learn about functional programming to go get this and really understand it. And it's this mentality of that our brains, well, and it matters a lot for things that we consider fixed, which are often in our heads. Everybody would believe that your strength is a growable attribute, right? Mm-hmm. That's why we go work out at the gym. Is literally you go lift heavy things because that's what makes us stronger. Growth mindset is really the same thing for attributes that are inside of us, like your compassion, your empathy, or your intelligence, or intelligence of various stripes, right? Like your emotional intelligence, your cognitive intelligence. All of these things are things our social ability, our social skills, all things we can grow over time. It just requires us to be willing to go fail at those things, to be challenged. And so that mentality where you look at something and you go, yep, I'm going to learn a whole bunch here, which is code for I'm going to screw up a whole bunch, right? But it's okay. You're framing that in a positive light because it is positive. Failure is learning.
Yeah, I think it was in her book that one of the takeaways I got from that was you shouldn't praise your kids by saying you're so pretty or you're so good at baseball. You should say, you worked so hard at this. I'm so proud of you for working so hard.
Yeah. She has a really good quote that's, so what should we say when kids, accomplish something with skill and with speed, like math problems? Mm-hmm. Should we deny them the praise that they've rightfully earned? I say yes. Instead, we should say something like, oh, I'm sorry for wasting your time with that. Here's something that will really give you a challenge.
Yeah. Yep, that's good. I remember that now from her book. I usually, when I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and I try to remember about 1 to 10% and then apply about 10% of what I remember. So that was that 1% that I actually remembered and applied.
Well, if you go from Drive, it's kind of the same thing with the praising your kids, right? He talks about that. And then one of his sources, Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn, or Cohn, I've never heard his last name pronounced. It's Kohn. Mm-hmm. Goes into the same things. His book is really fascinating because he talks about why you shouldn't use praise and rewards. It's two halves of a book. And then the first half, it's why you shouldn't use praise and rewards. First section is at work. Second section is at school. Third section is at home. And then the second half of the book is what works instead of praise and rewards at work, at school, and at home. It's a really fascinating book.
That's Punished by Rewards.
Yes.
I'm gonna put that on my to-do list to check that one out because I have not read that one yet. And I was actually listening to somebody talk about rewards and kind of the downfall of offering rewards to children. Me with 3 kids, I'm trying to learn how to be the best dad I can. And it focused on the fact that I think one of the examples where, if you give your kid a reward for emptying the dishwasher, then they're never going to see the actual value of why they should empty the dishwasher. They're only going to see that as a means to get the reward.
Yep. And if you take that reward away, they're never emptying the dishwasher again.
Yep. That was exactly what I got out of that. So yeah, I'm definitely going to put that book on my to-do list, and I'll link it up in the show notes as well for anybody listening that wants to check that out.
Yeah. So, I guess I want to wrap it up. Mm-hmm. Talking about the mental health piece a little more.
Sure.
Because to me, that's one of the pieces that it's a concept to me that is very dear to my heart. And I want to encourage people to go talk with their coworkers about their feelings, which sounds like the most horrible thing in the world. But really, once you start doing that, I've had a coworker before who, and this was before I had this mindset, and I really regret it. He was falling asleep at work. And so naturally, all of the rest of us on the team, would mock this guy behind his back, would make fun of it and, talk about it. I can't believe he's falling asleep. Listen to him, he's snoring. And we never asked him why. We never asked what was going on. And the thing about it is that if our brains make up a why. Oh, he's spending too much time playing video games, or, God knows what he's doing at night. That function of our brains where we tell stories, that's how our brains really process the world. And that function it can really hurt our relationships. Because for all I know, that guy's wife could have had cancer. And he was spending a lot of time at the hospital. Like, suddenly the story is very different, right?
Yeah.
Emotionally feels very different. And it's the same is true if I talk about how I really just can't get any sleep at night because I've been having a whole bunch of anxious thoughts. Mm-hmm. And I'm just laying there awake and I can't do anything about it. Telling that story in those frames allows us to communicate with each other when we need to lean out of work. We talk about people leaning in. Sometimes we need to lean out. Sometimes there's stuff going on, and I'm just going to get my 40 in, maybe not even that. I'm going to be taking a couple of weeks of PTO, chunks of PTO. I had a coworker that I talk with frequently who went through some heart problems, like had a micro stroke, they called it, because he has a hole in his heart. And so he went through a whole bunch of things to get that repaired and therapy, stuff like that. And he's still going through it. And he was like on the fence about telling people about it. I'm like, no, you want to tell your team because they're going to notice you not being at work. They're going to notice the time taken off and their brains are going to leap to conclusions. Mm-hmm. And the easy conclusion is, well, he's got something else going on. He doesn't care about the work. And turning around and saying, well, no, actually, I have a hole in my heart. People suddenly realize, oh, yeah, that's a little more important than shipping this particular release.
Yeah.
Unless this is also helping a bunch of people's holes in the heart, So talking about our mental states, our emotional states with each other is a way to build a resilient team. Because if I talk about it, then I know that my coworker feels, or at least hopefully my coworker feels, they can talk to me when they need to lean out. And we'll both understand and we can cover for each other. And as a result, build more relationships, build a better, stronger team together.
That's really good. I was actually talking to someone yesterday, and they mentioned to me that one of the things that they thought was lacking with a lot of leaders was the ability to integrate the fact that people have home lives and work lives, and that a lot of managers and leaders try to always separate that out. And you're supposed to check your your baggage at the door, from home life, but we can't do that. We're the same here as we are there. We're the same person. We carry that with us, and we can't check that out. And that a good leader needs to integrate the fact that and understand where his people are outside of work. What they're struggling with. Maybe not all the details, but to understand that they've got things going on that aren't work related that may affect their work.
Exactly, and even in a best case scenario, if I'm a worker that totally believes that I want to get this job done and I want to do the best I can, and I have something happening outside of work that's stressful, that's, taking up time, that's causing me some stress elsewhere, I can't drop that at the door. Like, my brain won't let me. It's going to be there in the back of my head every time, oh, look, I'm compiling for another 3 minutes. Look at that. I'm thinking about the thing again. Like, your brain just wants to, it's kind of like a dog chewing on a really ratty old bone. It hurts, but your brain just does it anyway because it wants to try and control the situation and it wants to try and arrive at a solution, sometimes to things that don't have a solution or where the solution is not anything you can do. And, there's all kinds of things that we can work on for ourselves to do less of that. But at the end of the day, it's just going to be, it puts on us what we call cognitive load, right? It's taken up a chunk of our brain space. Just think of it like a process running in the background, chewing up 3/4 of your RAM.
That's a good analogy.
It is. And it's going to eat, doesn't matter how much you try, you can't get rid of it. And it's going to make you less effective. And so pretending that you've left it at the door just makes things worse, because now you feel bad every time you think about it. Now you feel bad when you realize you didn't get as much work done today as you normally would because you you just got distracted constantly. And so now if you feel even worse on top of the stuff you already have going on, and that can put us into some very negative spirals.
So one of the things that I've been doing lately, actually I started it a couple of years ago, and I don't do it as often probably as I should, but I kind of try to give myself little checkups. And my company, like a lot of companies, have ERP programs where they give you 3 to 6 visits per year for free with mental health professionals. A lot of those you can do over Zoom or Skype or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been using those just to kind of make sure that I'm in check before I go down one of those paths of depression or something like that. And is that a good thing you would recommend doing? Or
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, therapy is not just for somebody somebody with a diagnosis, right? Therapy is for anybody dealing with something bigger than themselves. And the thing about it is that, I mean, think about it this way. Ideally, we go to the doctor every year for a checkup.
Right. So why not get our brain checked up?
Yeah, I make more money off of my brain than I do off of the rest of my body. Which of the two should I be getting checked out more regularly? No. And yeah, it can help, even if it's not, going in and just talking about it. Here's what I've been feeling. Mm-hmm. Here's the kind of stuff. These are people that the nice thing about a therapist is you're paying them and they have to sit there and listen to you for the whole hour. They can't run away. And they have to take notes on it. So they have to pay attention to what you've been saying and what you're saying now. And if you find a decent, if you find a good one you have a good relationship with, they can help you realize, oh, I'm starting to, like you said, going down a negative path. Mm-hmm. I'm starting to, the last time something really bad happened, before that happened, I was behaving in these certain ways. And people that are outside of you can recognize those behaviors faster than you can, usually. And so having somebody that can, whether that's a therapist, whether that's a coworker, whether that's a friend, who can call you on your shit. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I don't know if you can curse on this, but whatever. Yeah.
So I know for me, it's been I've had a mentor in the past it's always been very good at helping me with that self-awareness. But I think the more, I don't know how to say it, the more channels looking at you that you can get from other people, the more input that you can get, the quicker you can course correct whenever you are going off course in one direction or the other. Yeah.
And that can be a very valuable part of your lifestyle, your the way you work, because if your knee starts hurting, right, you're pretty sure you're doing something to hurt the knee. The same thing is true with the brain. A lot of the times emotions and things don't come out of nowhere. They come out of, oh, look, I'm getting into a situation that was like this other situation that I got into years ago where I had a very bad experience. So all of this anxiety that I'm suddenly feeling isn't coming out of the blue. It's coming out of my brain going, I don't know about this, and recognizing things going on that we aren't even necessarily consciously aware of. So getting as much feedback as we can, because it's harder with the brain to be our own feedback system, right? Because it's the thing looking at itself. How do you separate the two? So externalizing that into other people, into other systems, things like Dalio, which is a mood tracking app, a free mood tracking app. So you can set it up and it'll just ask you at 8 o'clock every day, hey, how are you feeling? And that can let you start tracking mood trends.
And how do you spell that, Dalio?
Daylio.
All right, I'll link that up in the show notes as well. All right, well, so I really appreciate this. I think this has been very helpful, and I think it's something that we in the tech community need to talk about more than we do, and maybe we can do this again sometime pretty soon. But before we call it quits, how can people find out more about this subject or more about your talks and you, and how can they get in touch with you if they have any questions? Yeah,
so you can find me on Twitter at Arthur Doler, and it's arthurdoler.com is my website. I have my talks up there. You can get in contact with me through that or through the Twitter if you're interested in having me come out and talk, because I do that both at conferences, at companies, stuff like that. As far as other stuff to read, I could overwhelm everybody with a reading. I actually should link this from my site. I actually just set up a Goodreads bookshelf, a couple bookshelves with some, like, one's a must read and one's a recommended read. I'll make sure I link those from my site.
Yeah, that'd be great. And like I said, I really appreciate it. And if you do go out and you want to look at some of Art's slides, the artwork in his slides was fantastic. So I want to give you a little plug for that.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you very much.